Hi, everybody. Welcome to Shasai Podcasts, conversations between scholars from around the world who study childhood, youth, and related institutions historically. As an official production of the Society for the History of Children and Youth, you can subscribe to these shows through iTunes or Google Play. Written and visual materials associated with each episode are available at our website, shcy.org. Enjoy.
Hello, everyone. It is a privilege, honor, and a great opportunity to be sitting here with Professor Michelle Purdy of Washington, Associate Professor at Washington University, who has recently published an amazing, I have my worn copy here, Transforming the Elite Black Students and Desegregation of Private Schools with University of North Carolina Press. And such a phenomenal book. I've read draft or two before I saw it in publication, and it's just a really good book. So congratulations on your publication.
Thank you, Dr. Hale. I appreciate you taking the time to talk with me this afternoon and all your support along the way. It's something else to think about, the fact that this summer marks 10 years of being a professor, right? First an assistant professor and now an associate professor. And then I go back 6 years of graduate school, and there's certain key folks who've been a part of the journey all this time. And you're certainly one of those folks who's been a part of the journey for a long time. So thank you for your help and support. And I look forward to the conversation today.
Of course, my absolute pleasure. And I know, like me, there's a lot of scholars in the field and students who really enjoyed the book. And then also, it's great that the Society for the History of Children and Youth, picked up and reviewed it. And I just want to pick up on a few themes, to go along with the journal, but then also just, I think, good information for us to really unpack a little bit about who you are, also as a scholar. And then in relation to this book you published. So if you don't mind, I'm interested about your intellectual journey and inspiration that led to write this book. But I also want to say in your epilogue, so I'll start with the end a little bit. You give us a sense, right? So you talk about writing this, you write, you undertook this project during Barack Obama's presidency of the United States, and you write also in this contemporary era of social protest and tension between diverse populations and institutions, the historical implications for considering the desegregation of Westminster, as you have in this book, resonates deeply. And that's so, there's such a powerful moment to be writing a book, and also very inspiring. And there's also just a lot going on. Could you elaborate about what it's like to write during this historic moment and what led you to write it?
It's been, so it has been a historic time, I think, for those of us who are committed to advancing the history of Black education, especially the history of Black education that shows Black folks as agents of change, right? And to counter long-held deficit notions that we know exist in research, whether in education or in other fields, that has led to many to hold deficit notions of Black folks and other marginalized people, right? And so it has definitely been an interesting time to research, write, and obviously have a book published within the last, decade and a half or so. But go back a little bit further. So what led to me wanting to write this book? So over 20 years ago, I started out as an undergraduate at Washington University in St. Louis, went there as an undecided arts and sciences student, and ultimately ended up taking classes in both education and African-American studies, and landed on those two areas as my undergraduate majors with a minor in music. And then through my classes in education at AFAS, I was exposed to such scholars as Vanessa Siddle Walker and her first book, Their Highest Potential, James Anderson's first book, The Education of Blacks in the South, obviously classic works by Du Bois, the list goes on, right? And then as well as just thinking about history of education in a very social historical way, really thinking about folks from the ground up, right? And so ultimately became much more interested in the history of education through my Mellon Mays project, which at that time focused more so on higher education. But stayed and did a master's in history. I wasn't sure after graduating if I wanted to do a PhD in history or a PhD in education. And I stayed and did the master's in history. And then I worked for a couple of years in Jackson, Mississippi at the private school I attended growing up. I went there K through 12th grades. And it was both doing the master's and working in education, both in higher ed and K through 12, that I decided that my research questions were really rooted in education, right? About what is it that we can do better for Black students, for Black education writ large, and how can I use the lens of history to help us ask and answer some of those questions, both historically and obviously for our, as folks in education, what does that history then help us to think about for the present, right? So my questions were deeply rooted about how do we make education better, but wanting to use the lens of history, as opposed to perhaps doing a PhD in history, which may have been more oriented around bigger questions about historical interpretation, et cetera, right? But it was working at St. Andrews and thinking about what I wanted to study in graduate school that led me to think about, we know so much about public school desegregation, and rightfully so, right? Most kids in the United States go to public schools. But as a Black woman growing up in Mississippi, I didn't know who had come before me in private schools. And private schools have a particular place in the Southern landscape, as they do throughout the country, I have learned since embarking on this book, but in particular in the South, where there were literally private schools, as you know, established by whites so that their kids could avoid even going to public schools, right? So I simply started out wanting to know kind of who were some of the first Black students to go to private schools, especially kind of elite historically white private schools in the South, right? And then I was fortunate to go to Emory University for my PhD in educational studies and to work with Vanessa Siddle Walker and to have other mentors there who spanned educational research, including Dr. Jacqueline Jordan Irvine, known for her amazing work in teacher education and leadership education, Carol Hahn in civics education and social studies education, and then be able to work with folks outside of the Department of Education, like Brett Gadsden, who was in African-American studies at the time, but whose first book had been on desegregation in Delaware, and then also with Leroy Davis, who was a historian in African-American history. So I was able to really kind of develop this interdisciplinary committee to help me shape a project that ultimately obviously became a lot more than just about who were the first Black students to go to these schools, right? So that was like my initial question. But then, as you know, as a historian, there's context, right? So then the question started getting into, okay, so I may know who the first Black students are, but I don't know why these schools even decided to desegregate when Brown versus Board of Education did not apply to them. So as much as we talk about and study the iconic Brown versus Board of Education decision, that decision had no legal ramifications directly for private institutions, right? So why did these schools decide to desegregate, or in some cases decide to increase the number of Black students attending them? Then I wanted to know, what was the culture like, right? For those of us who study schools, so much of what we are trying to impart to determine is how culture and climate affects student experience, right? And so then I had to dig into, okay, so what was the culture like at this school before Black students arrived, and then after they arrived, right? And then ultimately it became part of a national conversation because of how Westminster was situated as this leading private school in the South, with the school leader himself being one of the few Southerners to actually kind of be on the national scene with respect to independent education during the 50s and the 60s. And then ultimately, the heart of the book is still, and very much so, who were the first Black students? What did they experience? How did they navigate this place? From where did they come from? And so that's how the project unfolded, right? And so as a graduate student, I did research in the archives at Emory, at obviously at Westminster, at UNC Chapel Hill, but then also did oral history interviews with some of the first Black alumni of Westminster, some of their white counterparts, as well as the first director of minority affairs for the National Association of Independent Schools, who was a Black man. And in the midst of this, the United States elected its first Black president, right? So here I am literally finishing, my Spencer dissertation fellowship application the night that President Obama is elected. And then the next morning I fly to History of Education Society annual meeting. It was just, so, this project is developing in the moment in which the United States is confronting race in particular ways. On one hand, you have folks arguing what in 08, 09, we're post-racial now, right? Like we've elected our first Black president, right? And I do think his election in some ways may have helped people to feel more comfortable, especially some of the white folks I interviewed talk with me about some of the things that had happened in the 60s, right? In the early 70s when these first Black students desegregated Westminster. On the other hand, we know that he faced tremendous backlash, basically from day one, right? And so for those of us who were like, no, we're not post-racial yet, right? So this was also a moment of kind of a racial reckoning that has now played out, I would think. I mean, we've had racial reckoning play out over the history of the United States, but in particular, over the last, 10, 15 years, we've had it play out in significant ways. Really, you could almost go back to, 9/11 and Hurricane Katrina as well, contributing to how we're thinking about race in the 21st century, right? And in that 20 years, you and I and others are developing as scholars. So it's a really interesting time to produce work that centers race, right? And racism. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, and then a lot of interesting points raised, right? And I'll also say, knowing you as a scholar and colleague and friend for 10 years, to learn a little bit more every time we talk about your work and into it. I'll also say I think University of Illinois lost a golden opportunity to work with you. That did come up, but we could explore that later.
I was very fortunate to be admitted to several amazing graduate programs, including the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana. And even though I did not attend there, I will say I'm always very fortunate that the University of Illinois History of Education crew has continued to mentor, advise, and collaborate with me. So thank you all very much.
We most definitely appreciate that. But what the path you took, right, led to an incredible contribution. And also, hearing a little bit more about Jackson and attending private school in Jackson. I mean, Jackson is known for the infamous citizen council schools that were established as sort of the capital, if you will, of citizen council schools, right? But as you illustrate in your own trajectory with St. Andrews, that was not part of that network. And then Westminster is not. So there's a spectrum of private schools, and you're really making a contribution, right? Looking at private school desegregation, a topic that hasn't been covered as thoroughly as public school desegregation. Right. But then also, I like, going to your introduction now, or where it's a theme that comes up with this, I really like how it's framed here, where you talk about that you in the book contend the lines between public and private blurred as private schools became both focal points of policy and spaces to avoid public school desegregation during the mid-20th century. That just encapsulates a theme that's come up about the book. So it's not, you're talking about individual agency. So here are students who are themselves agents within the larger Black freedom struggle. Right. The complicated notions of private school and public school desegregation. And then you're hitting this even larger contextual point as a historian, where you're blurring these traditional public and private lines. So how, as you're writing this historic moment and making multiple contributions, how do you make sense, or how would you define or explain how you came to make these multiple contributions?
through lots of great feedback. No, I think it was really taking a layered approach to the project, right? To understand that to do a rich school history, whereas Westminster was my case study, right? But to understand schooling is to understand that schools do not exist in a vacuum, right? So schools exist within the type of schools that they are. They exist within the city or town in which they are, where they're located, right? So Atlanta is an important backdrop in this book, as well as just the larger South. And then ultimately through, obviously many conversations with Dr. Siddle Walker and then with others like yourself and feedback I received at conferences, right? Just kept churning with ideas, right? And this notion that somehow we constantly think of private schools as somehow separate, right? Somehow separate from the public sphere, somehow separate from the influence and the hand of federal government, right? Or even state government, which is not the case, right? And so while they are different institutions than public and they carry other issues than public, they are also susceptible to the winds of change and the winds of resistance, right? As they try to figure out how they're going to be situated within this kind of larger educational landscape. And that can be for both K through 12 as well as higher education, right? And so that became apparent just with continued reading, continued feedback, especially feedback I received from my readers on the first draft of the book manuscript when it was under review with UNC Press, right? And really, but that notion of blurring public and private became kind of obvious to me because, again, you have these inflection moments, right? So yes, Brown versus Board of Education does not necessarily legally affect these schools, but these schools themselves are responding to public school desegregation. They're not exempt from larger societal change, right? Let alone then over time in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the federal government begins to make stipulations to say, and because Black folks are fighting back against these segregationist academies, ultimately by 1970, 71, the federal government is saying, hey, look, you can't continue to get tax exemption status if you have discriminatory admissions policies on the books, right? So they're getting this perk from the federal government in terms of tax exemption status, where you don't have to pay taxes on X, Y, and Z. You are a nonprofit, right? And because of how people were misusing money and funneling money into these private schools, Black Mississippians fought back. And then by, 1971, the IRS stipulates that you have to have non-discriminatory admissions policies on the books, right? So as part of the larger civil rights movement, as large a part of the Black freedom struggle, no institution was exempt, right? Because racism was where and is where everywhere, right? So no institution is exempt, and no institution is exempt from the manifestations of white supremacy and into how they were founded and how they exist today, right? So that's how blurring and notions of blurring public and private came to the fore for me, and how I continue to kind of wrestle with that idea.
So you brought it back to what was I wanted to ask about, and perhaps probably the last question about unknown areas, but then future direction. So maybe you and I have talked about this before, and I've heard you present about sort of following the money, and it's a theme within the field of history, especially when you're looking at large educational institutions. When you follow the money, that leads to new questions, right? And especially when you look at desegregation of private schools and how tax exempt status has been used to finally force, institutions like Bob Jones University in South Carolina, notoriously racist and explicitly exclusionary. But yet with that status, federal government is able to sort of push more inclusive language, right? But at the same time, we have these private donors who are interested in appearing diverse, but not too diverse. So Could you perhaps elaborate on your thoughts on what you learned in this field? And then is this still leading, or do you see this leading to future research and perhaps book number 2 that we can all look forward to?
Yes, I think in part. I think it will take more of a backdrop in the next book, because the heart of this book for me has always been, though, how these Black students navigated this space, right? And everything else is hugely important context for understanding the space. But at the end of the day, we have to understand how Black students have navigated educational spaces historically in order for us to be able to perhaps get some glimpses into what are the structures and systems and policies and practices and ideas we need to help them in the 21st century, right? So for us to, yes. So to answer your question in part, yes, right? So I imagine that the next project is really, I'm still wrestling with the ideas, but the idea is to think about this convergence of philanthropy, especially from white donors, as well as federal government intervention, in the 60s and 70s, and what that intersection means for access and opportunity for Black students, right? So to understand kind of the intricacies of what were the motivations, right? What were the initial ideas, what ultimately got implemented, what ultimately didn't get implemented, how undergirded were these ideas with what we know were prevalent deficit notions of race and, in the 60s and the 70s, right? How do we problematize how we understand philanthropists and their motivations, right? And as well as institutions and their motivations for quote unquote wanting to be more diverse, but not too diverse. But then how do we understand how Black students, even when they don't know in the moment, they don't know all that context is happening. As a Black student on a scholarship or part of a special program, you may not have any idea of all this that's happening that led you to that particular moment of access and opportunity. And in the midst of that, you're trying to figure out, well, how do I navigate this? How do I thrive? How do I survive? But, as you know from your own work, how do I resist? How am I an agent of change, right? And so I want to continue both lines of inquiry that are present in the book, right? How do we continue to problematize what it means to be Black students? I don't necessarily know if it will be strictly in predominantly white spaces anymore in the next project. But really, how do we understand this first generation of Black students kind of coming out of the initial decades of school desegregation and the civil rights movement, and just getting a general sense of kind of just their daily rhythms? I think we've done a really good job, right, of understanding how Black students have galvanized at particular moments, right, around issues of agency and activism and resistance. But I think I'm getting more interested in just the daily kind of milieu of what it means to just be Black as a student in the 60s and the 70s, and how perhaps maybe particular programs shed light on that.
Yeah, because you talk about the programs, a lot of philanthropic programs that were put in place to recruit Black students and students of color to private institutions.
Right.
And then also it makes, I said that was the last question, but I might have one more, but bear with me here. So you're making me think, because again, one of the really, I think, one of the takeaways from this book is how you expertly blend two perspectives, right? So you provide a phenomenal institutional history, and you look at how tax exemption works and how admissions policies and who the board was and how they're making decisions. But at the same time, we get to know someone like Michael McBay very well. We follow him in his cohort and his peers in desegregating a previously all white private space, and how they get to know Black staff at the school who offered their cars and their homes and their networks to support this first cohort of Black students to desegregate Westman. So it's really an inspirational read in terms of how you blend that too, methodologically as well as conceptually, public and private. So how is a closing question? How, for the junior scholars in the room and also students and young scholars, what did you learn from how you navigate the academy? What can you share with those tuning in to sort of, how do you navigate the book process? Because it is very difficult. They don't talk about graduate school. So what is your parting wisdom, if you will, to how to navigate that?
You need multiple colleagues and mentors on which to call. You need folks who are willing to give you that honest feedback on that first draft without running and telling somebody, Michelle really can't write. So, and you need people who can read it from different vantage points. If you're trying to do kind of interdisciplinary work that combines both notions of policy as well as daily life, right? So you're going to need people who can read it and say, hey, well, think about this was, what the state with a capital S was advancing and doing. This is what Atlanta was doing. This is what these private schools were doing. But on the other hand, let's think about the complicated experiences of Black students navigating, interpersonal institutional racism. Let's think about the Black schools and Black communities out of which they come. So you have to create, what Carrie Ann Rockamore says in her professional development series, like a menu of mentors. And I would add a menu of colleagues and friends. And so for me, it was really important to be able to have folks like you and Elizabeth Todd Breland and Crystal Sanders and Ansley Erickson, who were like, we're kind of right in line with each other, right? Like either your book came out a year or two ahead, but it was really important to be in conversation with folks who had just kind of gone through the publication process, right? My colleague Shawande Mustakim at WashU as well. And then to have folks who've been in the, as we say, been in the game a little bit longer, who you can then also go to, but you might not go to them as frequently, but, I had the opportunity to work with folks like Dion Dans and Chris Spann on an edited book and to learn from them and to take a peek into how they think about how to produce this, complicated history, right? And then you have your, we have our senior scholars who we ask to be our discussants, right? And so you get feedback from James Anderson and Joyanne Williamson Lott. And, I would still find time to meet with Dr. Siddle Walker and at conferences and to talk with her with ideas. And then I had a tremendous mentor in my department, Marianne Zubak. She's been my longtime history of education mentor. You need somebody who's going to read your work and, really give you great feedback on writing, as well as just to be able to bounce ideas off. And so I'm fortunate to have had such a variety of mentors, but that, it does take time. So I would import to younger scholars, take the time to develop good relationships with people, and to go to the multiple conferences, to be willing to put your work out at what we did a session where at AHA, right? Like that, American Historical Association, our organization, American Historians, or be willing to take a chance on putting your work out in different spaces, right? Work with, get feedback from, the VP Franklins of the world, right? Like, and if they tell you that they took a long time reading something, as one of my, colleagues at WashU told me, they said, that's because they care about your work, Michelle. Don't feel disgruntled or like feel like ashamed that somebody says, oh, took me this long to read your work. But guess what? They still read it and they still gave you feedback. Right. So, so that's the advice I would give them, but it takes time and it takes energy. And, just stay true to the project, stay true to the original questions that you asked. I got a lot of different advice about how to start this book, about how to think about the introduction and do I want to do the national as the start? But if you notice, the book starts with the Black students in the introduction. It starts, Westminster has always been the heart of this story. what happened at this private school, but it's layered with all these other pieces. Right.
Well, I hope everyone tuning in took as many notes as I did. Still, learning as we go through, even publishing a book. And I think there's still a process of processing the material.
Oh, and I cannot, obviously, special shout out to my editor, Brandon Proya at UNC Chapel Hill, who is just a tremendous person, worked very hard with me to meet all the deadlines I needed to meet and to secure amazing readers. And I just want to give him a special shout out. Without him, helping to really help me understand the process at UNC Press, and just being there is a great resource as well. So.
Indeed. Well, Dr. Purdy, this was an amazing opportunity. I really enjoyed reading the book, enjoying the conversation as well.
Thank you so much, John. I really appreciate you. And thank you to Patrick Ryan, editor for the Society for the History of Children and Youth, and to anybody who tunes in.
Take care.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to Shusai Podcasts. You can find more materials and features from the Society for the History of Children and Youth online, shcy.org.